My name is Grace Exley, and I'm the Secretary of the Conferences Committee for the BSHS, and I am delighted to welcome you to this session on coral across disciplines. I'm now going to hand you over to Elias to get things started.
Hello everyone. My name is Elias, and here are my participants. I'm a professor of art history and visual culture at Sydney University, and I'm on the ancestral lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. So I'd like to start by paying my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Now, it's a real great pleasure to chair the session titled Coral Across the Disciplines. And I want to thank the organiser and presenter, Alison Glassie, for inviting me to chair this, this wonderful event. I'm the author of a book called Coral Empire, a book that looks at early 20th century coral explorations, when coral was implicated in exotic journeys and imperial geographies, and was consumed aesthetically by the mass media. But this is a round table, and the discussion is actually being generated by Alison, Sam, and Gemma, who are three brilliant and energetic early career researchers. The speakers in order of their presentations are first Gemma Sahwell, then Sam Muka, and then Alison Glassie. They've dedicated their careers to oceans, ocean representations, ocean animals and plants, and of course, the science of and the art of corals. So they represent in a way the kind of generational shift in tackling the challenges of climate and biodiversity crisis that we currently face. So welcome to our speakers and to you, the audience, for what will be an insightful roundtable on coral across the disciplines. And the roundtable is in fact sponsored by the International Commission for the History of Oceanography. Our first speaker, Gemma Sahwell, combines geochemistry with environmental humanities, theorizing coral as a scientific and cultural archive. Gemma's followed by Sam Muka, who examines the rise of artificial reef and coral restoration and asks searching questions about the science of opportunity. And then our third speaker, Alison Glassie, turns to Caribbean literature and to Rita Indiana's Tentacle, reading coral bleaching and climate catastrophe in the Dominican Republic. So the length of the session is 50 minutes. If you have questions, we would love that, if you would like to ask questions of the three presenters. And we ask you to do that in the Q&A function of Zoom. As you hear the speakers, please feel free to write your questions there, and we'll get to audience questions in the last part of the session. Gemma, Sam, and Ali will speak for about 7 minutes each. And then we'll hold a roundtable discussion, which will be based on three questions that will draw out intersections with the three speakers and their interests and their work. So Gemma, would you like to start?
Yes, thank you. So I'm just going to share my screen now. Okay. There you go. So thumbs up, everyone can see. Great. So as Anne said in my intro, I'm a PhD student actually in the geosciences at Princeton, where I study modern corals' potential as an archive for seawater chemistry by looking at stable isotopes and different elemental abundances in coral skeletons. So these modern corals that I study then act as an analog for more ancient coral systems, which I also am working with going back around 200 million years ago to see if I can back out information on ancient seawater chemistry. And as I have been thinking more about the materiality of and my own personal connections to the rocks and the corals that I'm studying, I started wanting to think more about this question: what makes coral an archive, or what is an archive, from a different perspective, one that might value memories and histories as kind of quote unquote data points to piece together a more holistic view on what it means to study Earth history. So in this presentation, I'm going to go over how coral can be used as an archive, both from an Earth history perspective and a more humanistic perspective. To do this, I want to start with kind of this case study object called an azabache pin. This pin has its roots in Spain, and the exact pin that you see on the slide is a picture of my own azabache pin, which my grandmother made for me when I was born. These pins, or sometimes they come as bracelets, are commonly given to newborn babies to ward off the mal de ojo, or evil eye, and bring good luck and health to that baby it's given to. So both my maternal grandparents' families actually left Spain most recently after the Spanish Civil War and migrated to Cuba. My mother and her parents left Cuba in the late 1960s and eventually settled in Miami Beach, where I was born and raised. The entire time my family was moving around amid civil wars and revolutions and trying to make a new life for themselves, they brought with them very few things, but one of those things that they brought was the memory of the importance of azabaches to our family and to our heritage. And I grew up in Miami Beach, where these azabache pins are ubiquitous objects, and everyone pretty much has one when they're born. But they carry with them this really important legacy of migration, history, religion, tradition of folk art, and most importantly, this display of intergenerational love. And so the red beads included in these pins are traditionally made of Corallium rubrum, which is a species endemic to the Mediterranean basin, which I'm going to focus on during this presentation. So now that I've talked a little bit about a case study object, I'm going to dive into defining some terms in my presentation's title. So as a geochemist by training, I would define an archive as an inorganic or organic material that serves as a reserve of past changes in climate and environment. And these archives contain climate proxies that can be actually measured to look at past climate and environmental conditions. And so proxies, which I mentioned, are measurable indicators that represent these unobservable variables in the environment, like temperature, which I'll talk about, which are embedded in the archives of Earth history. So the figures that you see on the slide are from a 2019 study that looked at the relationship between the concentration of magnesium relative to calcium incorporated into coral skeletons, specifically in Corallium rubrum, and that relationship with temperature to see if this particular coral is a good archive for seawater temperature. So the figure on the right, kind of this graph that you see, shows that magnesium incorporation in the coral skeleton increases with increasing temperature. And these two solid lines you see here, kind of in dark blue and red, are actually descriptions of that relationship between magnesium and temperature. So if they have the equations for these exact lines, and they're able to measure the magnesium to calcium ratio within the coral skeleton, they can plug that value into the equation for a line to back out a value for temperature. So in this case, we would call the magnesium to calcium ratio a proxy for seawater temperature. And the relationship the coral has in containing this proxy, or these proxies for, various environmental conditions, is what makes coral an archive. So this figure here shows a reconstructed temperature derived from the magnesium to calcium ratio in one coral individuals from a specific site. And that is compared to high resolution measurements, direct measurements of seawater temperature from that same exact site from 1974 to today. This is a very complicated figure. So the takeaway basically is that this 2019 study found that the magnesium to calcium proxy in Corallium rubrum is actually not so great for reconstructing exact fluctuations in seawater temperature. But this isn't to say that Corallium rubrum can't be used as an archive for other climatic conditions, or maybe this proxy just isn't a perfect fit for this archive. And this is just an example of the types of records that can be uncovered with a geochemical understanding of a coral skeleton. And that to emphasize that science is a messy art. It takes some experimenting to see what works and what doesn't. So now that we've defined what an archive is, let's define coral. So coral, as it turns out, is not a very scientific name, and it's not a very precise name. Coral is more of this like colloquial term that we all use as an umbrella term for these animals that exist under these three classes: Octocoralia, Hexacoralia, and Hydrozoa. And I'm no biologist, I'm a geochemist, but in the readings that I did to understand the history of this red coral that's incorporated into my Sabache pin, I found that this coral, Corallium rubrum, under the class Octocoralia, is very different than the coral that we imagine in shallow water reef systems, or scleractinian coral under the class Hexacoralia. And these scleractinian coral, the shallow water reef coral, are much more commonly used as archives of past climate and environment because we know a lot of information about how they form their aragonitic skeletons. Aragonite is just a mineral, and how that aragonite forms in seawater. So some, key differences between Octocoralia and Hexacoralia are that Octocoralia has an 8-fold radial symmetry. The animal itself has that symmetry. And they don't actually have a common process of calcification. So many octocorals secrete, different types of materials to create their body structure, sometimes using rigid proteins called gorgonin, excuse me. And sometimes they do produce a calcium carbonate, but there's no universal material that they make their skeletons out of. Whereas Hexacoralia have 6-fold radial symmetry, and they all pretty much create skeletons made from this mineral that I said before, aragonite, which is a form of calcium carbonate. So it turns out that Corallium rubrum, the species of Octocoralia, actually does create a skeleton of calcium carbonate, but its structure is completely, or extremely rather, different than a scleractinian coral skeleton. And perhaps this might explain why a proxy like magnesium to calcium ratios, which work so well as proxy for seawater temperature in scleractinian coral, aren't perfect fits as a proxy for Corallium rubrum. And so this is just an extremely simplified timeline of coral's evolutionary history that I made up, or that I created, rather. The main takeaway that I want everyone to have is that coral, all types of coral, Octocoralia and Hexacoralia, cover an amazing temporal range of Earth history. And because of this and their preservation in the fossil record, they have an amazing potential as archives to tell us about what Earth may have been like over that evolutionary history, started about 540 million years ago. And so, parting thought, I just want to return to our case study object here at the end. So Asabache pins, like I mentioned, are often given by relatives to newborn babies to protect them from the evil eye and give them good luck and good health. And often stories that are passed down in families about migration carry with them a sense of sacrifice and reverence toward our ancestors. And I think that there's a really common connection between Corallium rubrum itself as a living animal that records the environment where it's endemic to within its own skeleton and its own body, and the ancestors from that Mediterranean basin, that same area. That these people themselves carry with them these objects like these coral beads, and they both, these people and these coral act as archives for the memories from that specific location, and they carry that with them no matter where they migrate to. And with that, I just want to say thank you to Princeton Geosciences and the Blue Lab here at Princeton. And here are some, questions that motivate my continued work on the idea of a coral archive. So thank you so much for listening. And I'll pass the baton off to Sam.
Awesome. You're on the right panel when you just get super excited about the first talk. My project is fairly new, and so I haven't actually spoken to a lot of people about coral, recently. And so I'm just super excited to hear anyone talking about it. Here, I'll go backwards. So thanks so much for having me, and thank you for everyone on the panel. Today, I'm going to talk about a project that I have been doing for a while, but it feels like it's been a bit piecemeal because it was started during COVID, right? So I just finished my book. The book was published in December on tank craft, and one of those chapters was on reef technologies. And so I kind of floated into working specifically on artificial reefs, because most of the people who do artificial reef restoration in the NGO community are either coming from public aquariums or they're linked as hobbyists to public aquariums. And so I've gotten really interested in this. And so I'm a historian and sociologist of science. A lot of this is sociology based because archives were closed for a long time. So this talk is going to be featured a little bit more on interviews that I've done. So very recently, really within the last year, but this is just in the last 6 months, we've seen kind of an explosion of conversation about coral reef restoration. And a lot of this is, featured in the business world. So how can we have our cake and eat it too? Restore the coral reefs and make money doing it and possibly look good doing it. And so you see here Forbes, business, all of these different communities are jumping into coral reef restoration, coral gardening, construction waste, coral factories, and 3D printing. And so these are things that, when I started working on coral for my book, people were talking about, but in very kind of unstructured ways. And now probably I see an article every week that has this particular headline. And what we see is a valuation of coral reefs. And so this is one of my personal favorite websites. You can go on this website and plug in any reef that you want to and find the value of the coral reef per year. And so there's this very economic vision of conservation. This is nothing new, right? This is obviously part of a conservation ethic that is kind of built in, especially I have a tendency to think in the United States, this is how often we get conservation done. But commonly in the environmental history and history of science, we don't often talk about this. So we have a tendency to talk a little bit more about environmental history as like in the 1960s, you see this blossoming of an environmental ethic and Rachel Carson, and people start to love the world and want to save it. But instead with coral reefs, you're really still getting this kind of economic value placed on reefs. And a lot of this is that they break up waves, that they host fish, so they're a fish aggregation device, and that they are a tourist aggregation device. So in Australia and the United States, right, we see this valuation of not just reefs, but a very particular type of reef, an aesthetically pleasing reef. And Anne has written about this consistently. A reef is not a reef if no one wants to look at it, right? So this value is very important here, and it all of these, dollar amounts stand in for something kind of big. So I'm going to compare two projects just very quickly to give you a sense of who is interested in coral reef restoration. And even though it's become more popular within, the last 5 years, it's been going on in a kind of robust way since the 1950s. So the first one to look at is one that I've looked at here in the Long Island Sound. It's about 70 miles south of Fire Island, if you know what that is, in New York. It's called the Coal Waste Artificial Reef Project, and it ran between 1976 and 1988. The main academic community was SUNY Stony Brook, which is on Long Island, and they were working with an oceanography and environmental science department, a textile and materials engineering department, and there was one ecologist and evolutionary biologist in that group. Their money was from the U.S. Department of Energy and the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the New York State Energy Research and Development Program, and New York State Power Authority. And then there's this little group here, which is a private organization in California called the Electric Power Research Institute in Palo Alto. And they were funding the research to try to better understand how they could basically get rid of power waste, right? So this was exactly as it sounds. It's a project. They gave SUNY Stony Brook coal waste, access to coal waste, and then they asked them to build a brick that was chemically stable and would be able to stay underwater without, injury or leaching. anything in the water. Stony Brook did this. They ended up putting millions of coal waste bricks into Long Island Sound. The governor of New York showed up. Everyone was super happy. And their ultimate goal was fish aggregation, but mostly, and coral aggregation, but kind of mostly waste disposal, right? The other project I'm going to compare it to is almost brand new. So I was just at the University of Miami doing interviews for this project. It's called Hive, Sustainable Estuarine and Marine Revenement. The University of Miami and Penn State University are the head of this. University of Miami is the main academic researcher, and they have people from ocean sciences, marine, atmospheric, and earth sciences, and engineering. Their main funding comes from DARPA, the Florida Department of Transportation, and the city of Miami. And then they have this little group over here from the Tampa Aquarium. Those are the people that are doing coral. So DARPA, this project's ultimate outcome, DARPA would like Hive to place reefs towards the shore to reduce wave intensity by 90%. Okay, they don't care how they do it. They want it decreased by 90%. They've also tacked onto that project that they would like it to grow coral, so look like a coral reef, and to aggregate fish if possible, right? So Hive is relatively new. They've placed their first things in the ocean about 4 months ago, and they're monitoring them right now. So why do I compare these two? Well, in some sense, because they're both very far apart, but they're doing the exact same thing. And they give us a really good example of what coral reef restoration is all about. And part of that is they're about objects of opportunity. So both of these groups are working with the objects that they have available to them, right? And we see this throughout the artificial reef community, right? Coal waste blocks, but pretty much everywhere we're getting telephone poles. Texas has a reef made out of like 55 unused telephone poles, decommissioned oil rigs, rigs to reef, ships, bridges, pretty much anything that you can think of. They also operate on sites of opportunity. So military sites, often artificial reefs are asked to be built around military installations to hide major technologies, areas with state interest. Lots of tourist attractions call places deserts if they don't have reefs. So to build a reef, to build a tourist attraction, and industrial locations that we just want to make look better, right? So we see all of these different communities and all of these different interests, and they are providing both objects of opportunity and sites of opportunity. And around these two, groups of opportunity, we see the science building up. And so what this kind of begs the questions, right, is just like, how does this affect what academic departments can and do with their experiments? How does it impact the work done over time? And how does it affect scientific communication and the growth or lack of growth in knowledge? And especially to that last question, as the military becomes more involved, there's not a lot of communication going on between these particular groups because the knowledge becomes something which is a state secret. So when I've talked to these particular communities, they're not, publishing information, they're not talking to other groups. And part of that is because that's not what the ultimate goal of these sites are, right? What is really interesting to see, and I'll end on this, is how each of these kind of network nodes that are involved here, Tampa Aquarium, engineering departments, et cetera, they're just working as hard as they possibly can to get as much work done before that funding dries up again, right? So we see this push-pull of funding over the last, 50 years. Sometimes people get interested in it. A big study comes out that coral is going to save us all. But in truth, like, people are just trying to get as much research done on their particular part of that project before that funding dries up again. And what ends up happening is something like coal waste, artificial research or reef project. No one knows what's happened to that reef. No one's dived it. No one even knows it's there. It doesn't exist on a map. And so, all of these kind of questions about restoration open up more questions about kind of how science is done and how historians of science should be paying more attention, kind of how funding and networks, shape scientific research. I'll pass it on to Alison.
All right, I'm going to just share my screen right here. Can everybody hear me okay? All right. My not letting me share my screen. Open system preferences. So I think in the interest of time, I can just go ahead and get started. I'm just going to try sharing the screen once more. All right. Yeah, the screen sharing is not working right now, so I'm going to just go ahead and get into
what does it say when it says you're not allowed to share screen?
Well, it just says, if I try to share the screen, it says it wants me to open my system preferences, and then it's just not letting me allow Zoom to share my screen.
No worries. Okay, I'll
oh no, wait.
I was going to say, would you like me to share it? Because I have it downloaded on my computer.
Oh yeah, okay, that would work.
Okay, I'll just share it now and then just say forward whenever you want that, and I'll just go for you.
Okay, thanks, Sam. Oh, never mind. It worked out. Great, thanks. Okay. All right. Thanks. This is wonderful. So the small technological hiccup aside, and thank you, Sam, for being the slide person here. I'm really excited to be part of this roundtable, and I'm like, in listening to the presentations already, it's really gotten my thinking going on this chapter that I'm working on right now and sharing with you today. And so if you want to just advance the slide. So this this presentation is part of a larger book project called Atlantic Shapeshifters, Sea Literature's Fluid Forms. And what it's really interested in doing is, my background is in literary studies, but what it's really interested in doing is offering a more inclusive tradition of sea literature based on revaluing gendered and racialized ocean literacies. And so to do that, it's looking at 3 different figures and the forms of maritime experience they embody: Selkies, sea creaturely mariners, and African Atlantic sea deities. And also it's using physical oceanography as an organizing principle. So beginning in Nigeria, it's retracing the Middle Passage to Brazil and the Caribbean, and then follows the North Atlantic gyre kind of around the Atlantic Rim. So the material that I'll be working with today is drawn from the project's first chapter, Olukun's Aquarium. And this chapter is named for the Santeria Orisha of the deep ocean. And it stages a transatlantic conversation between Nedia Corafor's Lagoon and Rita Indiana's La Mukamade Mikunle. Sorry, family breakfast time, dogs barking, etc. But what I want to sort of give you by way of a roadmap here is that these are 2 speculative kind of sci-fi novels that are set respectively in Nigeria and the Dominican Republic, and that they're imagining worlds in which African-descended cosmologies inflect marine scientific practice. All right, forward. Okay, so today my discussion of tentacle begins not with coral, but with another member of the phylum Cnidaria that Gemma showed us earlier. So this is the Condylactis gigantea, or giant Caribbean sea anemone that you see on the screen. And this is a really popular aquarium species that's endemic to the Western Atlantic and the Caribbean. It inhabits sort of the shallow inner reefs and lagoons. It shelters in crevices, and it's not an anemone that you see in clusters. It's one that kind of lives singly or in small groups and kind of wanders around. It's also a carnivorous species. So it feeds by entrapping small fish, invertebrates, and zooplankton in its stinging tentacles, and then kind of drawing them toward the central column that ultimately digests the prey and redistributes the nutrients back out across the creature's body. And this sort of feeding strategy actually, I think, lends narrative structure to Tentacle. And the reason that I say this is that the novel's narrative tentacles kind of span three critical moments in the marine environmental history of the Caribbean Sea. The 17th century, when amidst abundance and biodiversity, quote, European imperial colonial expansion, this is Jeff Bolster, represented not simply a maritime phenomenon limited to the surface of the sea, but a marine phenomenon whose long reach was refashioning the supposedly eternal ocean. Okay, so 17th century, then we have 2001, right? And this is when apprehension of coral bleaching and climate change are becoming increasingly widespread, and discourses of a dying ocean are sort of on the rise globally. And then the novel begins in a kind of post-aquacalyptic, and that's a riff on a phrase from marine biologist Daniel Pauly. So this post-aquacalyptic 2027, when in the wake of a tsunami and a biological weapons spill, the Caribbean Sea has been transformed into a toxic chocolate-colored sludge. So the novel opens with disaster capitalist oceanographers streaming into the Dominican Republic, security systems gassing Haitian refugees on doorsteps, summoning robots to collect the bodies, and the last specimens of marine life fetching thousands on the black market, and receiving specialized care in private labs. And so what you have here is a novel in which the breakdown in social cohesion ashore mirrors the breakdown of the symbiosis between the humans and the sea. And into this breakdown, the novel introduces a Santeria priestess called Esther Escudero, whose ceremonial name is Omikunle, which is the cloak that covers the ocean. All right, so forward. So this is just a couple of more pictures of the kind of the way that I see this novel intervening in Caribbean literature, right? So I've argued elsewhere that by entrapping its readers with suspense about who is going to save the sea and whether it can be saved at all while dizzying us in these narrative tentacles that I've just described, Tentacle rises to climate change's deepening crisis of literary representation, right? It suggests that being eaten by a sea anemone, right, like this experience of being stung, stunned, and slowly digested alive, approximates the experience of climate injustice in the Caribbean. And in doing so, it's drawing on a long history of Caribbean writers looking to various elements of the ocean, whether they be physical or biological, in order to sort of create a regional literature. And so today, what I want to do is think in dialogue with Gemma and Sam and Anne about how this novel, in which corals and anemones kind of figure very prominently, reposition the aquarium, often a metonym for colonialist science and full belly environmental and conservation messaging within Caribbean epistemology and aesthetics. And so to do this, I'd like to direct our attention to the passage on the next slide, in which Asilde Figueroa, the novel's eponymous Mukama or housekeeper, investigates a suspicious humming sound coming from the room containing the altar to Yemaya, the sea goddess to whom her employer is devoted. So I'll just read this super quickly. She approached the altar, whose centerpiece was a replica of a Greek jar some 3 feet tall. All over the jar, there were offerings and the attributes of the goddess, an old oar, a ship's wheel, a feathered fan, but inside, perfectly illuminated and oxygenated by a mechanism adapted to the jar, Asilde saw a live sea anemone. Without putting the lid back, she looked around the bottom border of the jar to find the red eye that responded to the remote control and a small hole where a battery charger would fit perfectly. That's what the old lady was doing when she attended to these saints, monitoring the salt levels in the tank where she kept an illegal and very valuable specimen alive. And so curiously, this aquarium which is a sort of scientific conduit to spiritual wonder, is not meant to be seen, right? We normally think about aquaria as visual technologies, and this is something that, Anne, you have discussed extensively in your work, and Sam in your work on aquarium glass as well. So immediately we have a hidden aquarium that runs counter to what we normally think of when we think of this this technology, and this obscurity introduces the Divination Verse from Santeria, which echoes throughout Tentacle, which is no one knows what lies at the bottom of the sea. The anemone inside the concealed tank, the novel ultimately reveals, is the totem of Olokun. So this is the next slide, please. So this is Olokun, so a couple of representations of Olokun, who is the gender-bending species fluid Orisha of the deep ocean, said to calm tragedy and change destiny. And so as ocean heating, acidification, and declining dissolved oxygen disrupt the finely calibrated marine ecosystems beyond the novel, within it, Esther, the Santera, weeps as she's tending to this carnivorous anemone, which is one of the last of its kind. And so what I want to suggest here is that her tank craft, to use your term, Sam, is also this devotional practice. It's spiritually charged and also belated as an assumption of responsibility for a catastrophically damaged Caribbean Sea. And just a little bit of background here: in Santeria, practitioners make regular offerings to these sort of multidimensional deities called orishas, which are associated with different habitats or elements of the natural world, and linked to the Catholic pantheon of saints. And these orishas can reside in ceremonial objects like the anemone. So Esther's care of this anemone, which encompasses daily monitoring of temperature, salinity, and dissolved oxygen, biweekly feedings, and periodic tank cleaning and maintenance, is literally an attendance on the orishas of the ocean. And so let's advance the slide, please. Yeah, so a few chapters later, the anemone contained in Olokun's aquarium is going to play a crucial role in this sort of simultaneous initiation and gender affirmation procedure that opens a portal to Tentacle's other two storylines, sends a Sealday, who assumes the body of a man, back in time to save the sea, and also sort of mirrors the process by which corals, when they're bleaching or stressed, expel their zooxanthellae, or symbiotic algae. And both of these sort of prior historical storylines center on Playa Bow, which is a reef-encircled lagoon near the north coast town of Sosua. And in the 2001 storyline, which is where I'll focus in what time I have left, the visceral apprehension of the looming catastrophes of ocean heating and coral bleaching sends a privileged marine biologist named Linda into a full-blown mental health crisis. And interestingly, what offers her a path to sanity are coral conservation and restoration techniques, such as fragging, which is cultivating fragments of coral in underwater nurseries for replanting in the wild, and creating marine sanctuaries. But problematically, right, Linda's efforts are funded by her generational wealth and based on privatization. And so what they do is they end up marginalizing the reef's traditional taino protectors, who have functionally already established this area as a marine sanctuary. And yet, even though it's giving us this sort of, I think, a very round critique of a lot of the ways in which scientists from beyond the Caribbean intervene in the region, Tentacle's fusion of Santeria and tankcraft, which I would suggest are a set of practices that exist somewhere between traditional ecological knowledge and Western institutional science, persist even in Linda's efforts. And then here is also where the novel kind of brings in this phenomenon of sites and objects of opportunity, which you just described, Sam. The lab that these characters establish Linda's husband, who is actually a Seal Day, thinks to himself at the Swank opening gala, is the altar I'm going to build for Olokun, in which I'll turn Omikunle's Yoruba prayers into an environmental call to action. And so I want to kind of leave you with the idea that as this novel travels between the past, the near present, and a catastrophically imagined future of the Caribbean Sea, it constructs, uses literary tools to construct a kind of dream data set on climate change and marine ecological collapse, a 400-year time series centered on a single place. The novel makes clear, though, that this data set is both fragmentary and fragile. It's contingent on time travel and on recovering Taino ocean literacies, and also contingent on this sort of literary history of the Caribbean, which draws so much on the ocean. And so it is only by peering into Olokun's aquarium, on linking spirituality with the scientific knowledge gained by tending to corals, anemones, and oceans under glass, that this novel's readers might respond to the climate change that we're facing beyond it. And I'll stop there. All right. Okay.
Excellent. Oh, look. So Gemma, Sam, and Ali, you've demonstrated so richly how coral excites the cultures of art and science in your talks. I just want to remind the audience that if they'd like to ask questions, to put their questions in Q&A now that you've heard the three presenters. That would be fantastic. And while you're thinking about that, we're going to address a question ourselves. I'm just mindful of the time here. Let me start with the first question. And it's to our three panelists who can answer in their own way. The question is this. So corals, soft and hard, are iconic ecosystems, and as you say, face dire futures with climate change. Why is it important right now for the future of corals and the future of oceans and ocean health to engage a variety of methodologies as you do, across multiple disciplines as you do, to cross those discipline boundaries, to share knowledge, compare knowledge? Why is this important? And do you think innovation and change has already come from this kind of interdisciplinarity? Can I start with Ali? Is that good?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. So I think certainly that this sort of question of engaging methodological differences and interdisciplinarity has always been important to my work. I think as sort of as a scholar, it keeps us as scholars, it keeps us humble, right? And it keeps us from kind of thinking that the knowledge that is coming out of our disciplines is sort of the be all and end all. It's also, I think, not how, I think what your talk really illustrated so well, Sam, was the way that, like, when you were talking about the knowledge coming out of the Reef project, the Hive Reef project, as becoming a state secret, right? That's what happens when knowledge and perspective and methodology is not shared, right? It becomes sort of the equivalent of a state secret, and problem solving doesn't happen. And so I think for my work, as a literary scholar, coming from a background from a master's program in marine policy, what struck me was that was missing from the field from which I had transitioned was that we weren't taking people's stories seriously, and that if we were to create change and make decisions that ended up kind of being, I think, more representative of the places and the places that we hoped would benefit from them, right? that meant taking stories seriously. And so for me, that is a way where I see these disciplines sort of cross-pollinating each other. I'll stop
Thanks,
there.
Ellie. No, that's good. Sam, if you'd like to say something, and then I'm going to ask Gemma to answer the question in Q&A.
Yeah, I'll just say, I think there's very few, actually, there's no field that can lay claim to being the main subject of the history of the ocean, right? Or we even have these arguments, right? You try to define marine biology and you're like, I don't know, someone gets on a boat or maybe stands next to the ocean, whatever, it's the ocean. But I think it was especially telling in Gemma's talk when she said, I'm not a biologist, but I had to do all this biology, right? Like I'm a geochemist, that's totally different. And so what's really beautiful is anytime you're studying the ocean, regardless if it's coral or not, you have to engage with interdisciplinarity. It just doesn't exist otherwise. And so I think for me, especially working on more contemporary things, I want to show people that they can skip the step where they have to, tell everyone why they're doing it. Oh, I'm going to have to tell you why I'm calling a literary expert and also like a geochemist to talk about, like why I want to do coastal restoration, somewhere else. That's like, here, I'll explain it for you. This is the nature of marine research as it exists, right? And so for us, I think that when we engage with interdisciplinarity, that's how it is to engage with the ocean, right? And it's a good example of what that is when scientists start to do it, right? They're going to need a literary expert too, right? And I know a good one to call.
Sam, that's brilliant. Thank you very much. Gemma, would you like to answer the Q&A? And just for a couple of minutes, and we're going to have to wrap up.
Sure. So I'll just read the question really quick. So the question is, the idea of coral as a natural archive is fascinating. Is this a conceptualization that applies to other elements of the natural world, such as trees, geology, Antarctic ice? What are the pros and cons of using this conceptualization? And simple answer is yes, it applies. It is a conceptualization, I think, in geosciences and environmental sciences as a discipline that applies to, field geology, so like sedimentology, sequence stratigraphy, basically putting rocks that you see in context with each other. Trees like coral have concentric growth rings that you can actually make these direct proxy measurements from and try to figure out, past CO2 levels, temperature, all that stuff. Even paleo fire, like reconstructing fire seasons in past years. And Antarctic ice is a huge and like kind of growing field of archival study in earth sciences right now. My academic advisor, actually, John Higgins, got his roots studying carbonate rocks. So these calcium carbonates, so like, similar to the coral skeleton, but right now he's actually focused a lot on traveling to Antarctica and actually like dating Antarctic ice from ice cores and trying to piece together kind of past atmospheres from the trapped gas in the Antarctic ice, excuse me. So it really, these natural earth materials being used as archives is like very common practice in earth sciences, and kind of there are a lot of, I'm obviously very excited by it. There are a lot of pros to piecing together, earth history and understanding past Earth's climate to understand present Earth's climate, and kind of where we might be heading in the future. So, I mean, that's a pro. And I think like I've been focused on the cons for a little bit, especially with my coral work, just because like Antarctic ice or coral, these kind of two materials are threatened by climate change. So sampling or taking away that material from the earth to study it for science feels very almost like frivolous and luxurious at, at some points. And I think that, there's kind of this growing conversation in earth science right now on how can we, there's so many samples that exist in institutional archives. Do we have to do more field sampling to really be able to answer the questions that we're interested in? Sometimes the answer might be yes. A lot of the times the answer might be no. And this is kind of one of the questions that motivates my continued work, is how do these, natural history archives like coral and Antarctic ice actually get incorporated into the institutional archive of like natural history museums, art museums, and kind of the stories of and the histories of those specimens being incorporated into these museums. I hope that wasn't too long-winded, but thanks for the question. Oh, Anne, I think you might be muted.
I'm so sorry. I won't say it all again, but look, really, it has been a special session. Thank you so much to the speakers, Gemma, Sam, and Alison. We're out of time, but if you've enjoyed this session, please consider joining BSHS to support our activities in the future. And thank you again for attending. Thanks everyone on the panel. Just absolutely spectacular research.